We're going to talk today about the remarkable elections in France and Britain and what they mean for us here in the United States and globally. We're going to talk about the United States imposing restrictions on trade with Mexico and why that's a global issue too. And finally, we're going to compare Trump and Biden on the question of Social Security funding and what the conditions are that people ought to worry about in terms of future benefits that are supposed to come to masses, millions of Americans, but may in fact not be there. And then we'll have the second part of the program devoted to Dr. Harriet Fraad, talking about the radical changes in marriage and birth rates in the United States, but also globally, as the economic condition of women radically alters, and that, of course, touches all of us in multiple ways. So let's get started. A story about the elections that took place in July in France and in Britain is, of course, complicated by the fact that for many in the world outside of those countries, or at least outside of Europe, are not aware of those details about the elections and are relying on mass media to convey them. And that poses a special problem in the United States. And I must say, as a person who's attentive to the media, particularly in the United States, the coverage of those elections in Europe was so bad, so incomplete, and so biased as to be qualified not really as reporting anymore, but as sheer propaganda. It might be that we ought to extend the old remark that the first casualty in every war is the truth to the first casualty in a mass media driven by profit is also the truth. Let me explain. Prior to the elections in Britain for the parliament there, and in France for the National Assembly, effectively their parliament there, prior to those elections, the whole discussion in the United States had you believing that there was a good centrist president or leader on the one hand, and a profound challenge from the right wing on the other. In other words, the British and French were presented as though they were a kind of rerun of the United States, a centrist Biden challenged by a right-wing Trump. But that was not true. That was not the case. It should not have been presented that way, and the election results should have made the American media, mass media, most of them, ashamed and eager to excuse or explain how they could get it so wrong. But of course, we haven't had that. And I've waited a week or two or three before presenting this in the hopes that maybe it would show up, but it didn't. So let me briefly substitute for what you should have been told. The right wing was in office in Britain for the last 14 years in the presence of the Conservative Party. In the elections on the 4th of July, the Conservative Party was totally defeated. It lost the overwhelming majority of seats it once had in the British Parliament, the House of Commons. To its left, the Labour Party called, for good reasons, won overwhelmingly. It now has an absolute majority, huge majority, one of the biggest in the history of Great Britain. They govern totally. The Conservative Party is a small shell of itself, and there are serious debates in Britain whether the Conservative Party will survive. So there wasn't a big challenge from the right. There was effectively little or no challenge, and it didn't get a significant number of votes. The left much as it's a moderate left, in England won overwhelmingly. But the story is even starker in France. You know, in France, Britain too, but particularly in France, they don't have just two parties. That's an American kind of idea. You know, Americans pride themselves, as I've said to you before, about having freedom of choice. We like it to be able to go and buy one of a bewildering array of automobiles. Different companies, different brands, different models. Wow. And we like to go into drugstores and see that there are 20 kinds of toothpaste. Some with red stripes, some that taste like vanilla, some that have blue dots, you know. But when it comes to political parties, two is enough, thank you very much. We don't want or need, apparently, freedom of choice. The Europeans, backward folk that they are, they like freedom of choice, including in their politics. So in France, there was a right wing, a serious one. And it does challenge for political power in a serious way. You don't have that in Britain, but you have it in France, and you have it in other countries. The leader in France is a woman named Marine Le Pen, the National Front. And she posed a challenge. They have a centrist government, Mr. Macron, and he has a political party that's in the center. But what Britain doesn't have, and the United States doesn't have, and France does have, is an organized left wing. It comprises several parties. 4 of them, and that's not all of them, but 4 of them got together. They unified. The French Socialist Party, the French Communist Party, the French Green Party, and the biggest of the leftist parties, which is called France Unbowed, La France Insoumise. They got together in a new popular front, and they ran in the elections as the left-wing alternative, what French people could vote for in the 2 steps that they have their votes there, one on June 30th, one on July 7th. And guess what, American audience, foreign audience? The left wing, the unified new popular front, won overwhelmingly. In the final election, the second tour, the left wing got more votes, that new left party that includes the communist and socialist parties, is the largest single bloc in the assembly. Did not win a total majority, but they're the biggest bloc. Coming well below them, the centrist government of Mr. Macron. The sitting president came in a distant second, and an even more distant third was the right-wing nationalists under Marine Le Pen. They got very few seats. They were soundly defeated, and the winner was the socialist, communist, and other left unified together. These are 2 of the most important countries in Europe, France and Britain. They will have an enormous effect, these election results, on a Europe moving leftward. Wow. Quite a challenge for the United States, which doesn't have anything like that yet. A challenge, but also an inspiration. Imagine what would happen in the race that Americans now face between Trump and Biden if there were a real left alternative. If Bernie Sanders or AOC or who knows else might say, look, there is another way to go. Europe has told us what they're going to do if they have that opportunity, because they just did it. Think about it. It's not unimportant. I want to turn next to the United States punishing Mexico Why? Because a few senators learned that some of the steel exported from Mexico into the United States comes from other countries and goes through Mexico, in effect, to get to the United States. So if the United States is trying to block steel from coming from China or some other place, which comes through Mexico, it can do that now. But if you block it off, if you say to the Mexicans, you can't sell us anything that comes into your country from somewhere else, the Mexicans might bend to this, being told by others what they can and cannot do, something Americans would not like to have put on them. But maybe because Mexico depends on selling a lot to the United States. And the United States, those same senators, because it's a great photo op, want to do that to other countries. Because, of course, if China wants to sell steel to the United States and isn't allowed to, they don't have to go just through Mexico. They could go through, pick any one of the 190 other countries. And they will. And they already are. And what is exactly the United States going to do? Punish every country in the world that operates that way? You know what you're going to do then? You're going to self-destruct the United States, because you're going to force every country in the world to choose between dealing with the United States with all its rules and punishments or dealing with the BRICS, China and its allies. And as I have told you before, China and its allies are now a bigger, richer economic bloc than the United States and its allies, the G7. So if you're forcing the rest of the world step by step to choose, they're going to choose your enemy. This is not a strategy. It may be great as a photo op for a senator who wants to become Mr. Trump's vice president or has other ambitions and hopes nobody thinks through what it is they're doing. You know, like the decision to support Ukraine or Israel. Good for the political moment, but in the long run, terrible. The last economic update we'll have time for before our break has to do with Social Security. Look, here's the reality. Social Security could have been, should have been, but wasn't. An obligation that the United States as a society undertook to say to people who have given a lifetime of work, we are not going to throw you on the dust heap of history when you get old. We respect you. We appreciate all you've given. We're going to give you a pension. You're going to pay into it, but it's an obligation. It's a kind of like children take care of their parents. But we didn't. We made it depend on taking money out of people's workers' pockets. Not rich people, they're exempted from most of their wealth. But average middle people and poor people, you pay out of your weekly paycheck. And that means if the population gets different, more older people, fewer younger, is going to be a problem because the fewer younger are putting less money in than the larger number of older are taking out. We're at that point. What are we going to do? We could go and tax the rich who have been getting away with not paying Social Security on their wealth. Everybody pays up to a certain amount, and if you earn more than that, which the rich minority do, you don't have to pay on that. That's crazy. You also don't have to pay on the money you get from dividends, interest, and capital gains, just from your wages and salaries. That's a gift to the rich, too, because as we know, 10% richest own 80% of the shares. So if we make the rich finally pay their fair share, we don't have a problem with Social Security. It's the age-old question. Are you going to make those most able to pay or not? In Social Security, not. And neither Trump nor Biden are doing anything about it. And they won't unless you and I make change happen. You know, maybe like they did in Europe in those elections. We've come to the end of the first half. Please stay with me. We have an exciting interview with Dr. Fraud coming up right after the break. Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. I am very glad to bring back, as many of you have requested, Dr. Harriet Fraud before our microphones and our cameras. She is well known to you, but I want briefly to remind you, she is a mental health counselor and hypnotherapist in practice in New York City. She appears on the radio and TV as a speaker on the impact of economics and politics on personal life in America. She also hosts the podcast Capitalism Hits Home on the website and on YouTube for the Democracy at Work channel. So let me begin by thanking you, Dr. Fraud, for joining us yet again.
It's a pleasure yet again.
All right, let's begin. You have been talking about a statistic, one that I found amazing and novel, partly because I don't pay attention to these particular statistics as much as obviously you do, but also because I think this will interest a global audience very broadly in many ways and is a topic that ought to get much more attention. So let me begin by posing a question. Is it in fact the case that women are getting married much, much less often in the United States than they used to? And if so, how long has this been going on for?
Well, this has been going on since the 1970s. And they are getting married, not only women, men and women both are getting married much less. Less than half the population is married now, whereas in the 1960s it was 72%. Quite dramatic. And every year it's fewer. And it's much fewer people who are married in Generation Z and in as people go down in age, they are married even less. For the first time in American history, the majority of women are not married, and by choice. So it's quite dramatic.
Now, is this something that is also happening in other parts of the world? So we should think about it globally, or is it more restricted to certain parts of the world?
Well, it's much more pronounced in the United States and Western Europe than it is, let's say, in Africa, where the strictures around marriage, particularly for women, the servitude, the living with the family's patrilocality, you have to move to where your husband is, and you're supposed to serve his mother and his parents. Those strictures are much greater there. But even there, women are opting out of marriage in creative ways. So, for example, in Guinea-Bissau, there's a big trend, up 1/3 of women who marry migrants. So they can be married and have the respected status, but they don't have the guy around and they don't have to serve him and his parents. You know, they're very, also widows don't remarry in many societies. They remain widows. And it's so unspoken, this trend in rejecting marriage. There's no word for widow. So, you know, they're a kind of blotted out development, but it's happening all over the world.
All right. Now the logical next question, or at least one logical next question. Are birth rates falling? In other words, if women are marrying less than ever before, if that's happening globally, although at different rates in different parts of the world, what is happening to population growth, to the birth rate, to the people that make this planet the unique place it is?
Well, in a very dramatic fashion, the UN released figures that by 2100, instead of the year 2000s, by the end of this century, 97% of the nations in the world won't be able to reproduce their populations. So that, and the only people who will reproduce their populations are sub-Saharan Africa, where birth control and more modern patterns haven't happened yet. So that is very dramatic. In some countries like Japan, it's so dramatic that the Japanese government will give a bar $35 for each person who comes to the bar in order to have mixers and give free drinks, because they want men and women to marry each other and to meet each other and to have children, most importantly, because they're in dire straits population-wise. France is a little better because France differs from the other Western nations in that it has the best child care center that you can have, and you have available child care from the time a child is born at $1 an hour, really starting at 3 years old.
I'd like to take this into a direction of some economic analysis, because I think it is so important. We have seen in recent decades, and you have been on this program and talked to us about it, a shift in more and more women, adult women, going into the paid labor force, not staying at home, not minding the house or the children or the elderly, all the functions that women have classically or traditionally been assigned. But that women, often in addition to all of that work, are now, in recent decades, going out more and more to compete with men to do paid labor in all the jobs that societies have. Now, let's put these two things together. This has been a fantastic boon for employers. They have had an enormous increase in the supply of what they buy, namely working people's time and energy and brains and muscles. And so they've been able to hire more. They've been able to take advantage of women and men competing for jobs, accepting lower wages or poorer conditions than they might otherwise have been able to get. So are you telling us, in effect, that what was good for the profitability of capitalists has radically altered the family as an institution, basically putting it under enormous strains without much support for how to survive that or how to find an alternative to it? Are we witnessing a kind of crisis of capitalism hidden because it's buried inside the family unit, which thinkers and media don't explore the way they might if it happened in the workplace? If that's not too murky.
Absolutely true. It's just very interesting that although children are born less and less in the United States, and also people are being married less and less, that is a class phenomenon. The top 1% are getting married and largely staying married. The middle and the poor are not. And Blacks are staying married and getting married less because they're poorer by and large in the United States. But it is, if you have the money, your life is not altered by this. So, for example, Sheryl Sandberg, with her 6-figure salary and her husband's former he died, but 6-figure salary, and her independent wealth, she being a vice president of Facebook and a founding vice president, she says women can do it all. That isn't true, that you can't have children and still a vibrant career. I do. You have a helpful husband, it really helps. P.S., she doesn't mention she had 9 servants. So the 1% are getting married and staying married more. They also are having numerous children, something that no one else does, because they are hiring other people, usually other women, to do the kind of domestic labor that children and home and marriage and dinners and all that stuff require. One of the reasons marriage is breaking down is they just did a big study, and they found that even if you're a single mom but are living with a man takes 7 hours more of domestic labor. So more and more women are opting out. because having a full-time job and then doing domestic labor, emotionally caring, physically caring, creating social ties, it's too much for women. And so they're opting out. But we have to see it as a class phenomenon, which has happened as family wages were withdrawn because well-paid male jobs were outsourced to nations that pay under $10 an hour. And therefore, men couldn't support their families. Women were driven into work and can't stand the extra burden. And men are under stress as well. So the basic institutions like marriage and child rearing have broken down. And that is the fault of the greed of the capitalism that this is happening. And it's indicative because the people to whom it is not happening are the top 1%. There's a book called Park Avenue Primates, which is a study of this by Wednesday Martin. She's looking at the top echelons and where their lives have not been altered by not getting married or getting formally divorced or getting informally divorced. Their marriages are intact and they have often numerous children, all going to expensive private schools and so on.
So the irony of modern capitalism is to make the traditional family a luxury good. It is something only the rich can really enjoy. They can celebrate it. In addition to making it impossible for middle and lower income people to have that kind of a marriage, and the women are opting out, as your statistics show us, the irony here is really rich. You're taking away from the mass of people the affordability of the institution you celebrate, so you make them feel bad that they're not in what you have made it impossible for them to do, and you lord it over them literally by doing it yourself. Somebody ought to write that up, you or somebody, because it's a stunning window. When you add, which allow me, that men's wages have not gone up in recent decades the way women's have, because they've come into the labor force and been able to go up. You have created a family which can't survive, but on top of that, that the men are shortchanged relative to the women. For the women, it's a liberation of sorts. It's coming out of the house. It's getting into the workplace. It's getting some recognition, if not an equal amount, etc. But it puts the men in a relatively declining position. And then when you look at voting statistics, who's voting for Biden and who's voting for Trump, it's kind of clear how it matters what you're telling us. Is there anything, and we don't have much time left, but is there anything changing this? Or is what you are telling us something we can expect to continue and become more noticeable in the months and years ahead?
It's being more noticeable. Marriage rates have gone down just in the last year. You know, it's more noticeable the world over as neoliberal capitalism has extended its hand. It's everywhere except sub-Saharan Africa. It's much less developed. But of course we can expect this. And what we have to do is include personal life in our organizing and create other forms so that people can live together. And there are these forms. I mean, there are just in Oakland, California alone, 2 communities where single mothers raise their children together. We can create better jobs. We can create full universal childcare in the United States. You know, in the United States, the median salary for workers is $48,000. That's as many below as above. But if you have just one infant in daycare, it costs over $16,000, $16,500.
We've come to the end. I know that it's always this way when you're on the show. We just get going and we run out of time. We will have you back. Thank you very, very much for the insights you bring. It's a whole nother dimension. It makes the programs richer than they would be otherwise, and we're all grateful for it.
朋友都知道我是很挑剔的， 防晒乳我选 KISS 皇家呵护抗光清爽高防晒凝露，因为它有媲美蓝光神盾的抓藻植萃，保护我在阳光下延缓肌肤老化，维持青春弹力。可以防御工作环境里的3C 商品，各种光源对肌肤的伤害，擦起来清爽不黏腻。我特别喜欢它做到海洋友善，365天，天天抗光抗老化，是我的保养日常。你呢？呵护您，呵护全家人，专属你的 KISS Royal Care 抗光清爽高防晒凝露。